November 18th, 1987. The rain had not stopped for 3 straight days outside Mason City, Iowa, and by sunrise the entire east field near County Road 14 looked less like farmland and more like a black ocean of mud. Cold wind rolled across the empty corn stubble, while diesel smoke drifted through the gray morning sky. Nearly 40 men stood around the half-buried transport truck in silence, their boots sinking deeper every minute. The truck itself was enormous, 42 tons of drilling equipment chained to a long steel trailer, now swallowed almost to the axles by the soaked earth. Every attempt to pull it free had only dragged it deeper into the field. 2 hydraulic recovery rigs sat nearby, covered in mud, their steel cables hanging loose like defeated snakes after snapping twice before dawn. And standing in the middle of it all was Darren Cole. Expensive leather jacket, bright white hard hat, gold watch shining through the rain. Darren owned Cole Recovery and Transport, the largest salvage company in northern Iowa. He had built his reputation on television advertisements and loud promises about modern engineering. According to Darren, there was no machine his company could not recover. But that morning, the field had embarrassed him. A crowd had gathered along the roadside fences. Farmers, mechanics, local reporters, even high school boys skipping class just to watch the disaster unfold. Some held coffee thermoses while others stood with their hands buried deep in coat pockets against the bitter wind. Every one of them waited to see whether Darren would finally admit defeat. At 8:17 that morning, he finally did. That truck's finished. Darren shouted across the mud. We've burned $20,000 trying to move it. She's dead where she sits. A few men nodded heavily. Others stared at the buried machine with the strange silence people use around something they already consider lost. And that should have been the end of the story. But 10 minutes later, an old sound rolled across the field. Not the roar of a modern diesel engine. Something slower, something rougher. The crowd turned toward the gravel road, just as a faded gray Fordson tractor appeared through the mist. Its steel wheels rattled against the stones. Exhaust coughed from a crooked pipe welded together decades earlier. The machine looked ancient even for 1987. Rust covered most of the hood. One headlamp was missing entirely. The paint had long ago surrendered to weather and time. And behind the wheel sat Walter Boone. He was 72 years old that winter. Thin shoulders, heavy gloves. Brown coat faded nearly white around the sleeves. The kind of man people stopped noticing after a few seconds, because he never demanded attention from anyone. But the moment Darren saw that tractor approaching, he laughed out loud. "Oh, Lord," he shouted. "Now the museum's here." The crowd erupted. A few salvage workers leaned against their trucks, laughing openly, while one younger mechanic nearly dropped his cigarette into the mud. Walter slowly stopped the Fordson near the ditch and climbed down without saying a word. He looked first at the buried truck, then at the broken cables, then at the churned earth around the wheels. Not once did he look embarrassed. Darren walked toward him, grinning. "You seriously think that thing can pull 42 tons?" he asked loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "That tractor belongs in a parade. Old man." More laughter rolled across the field. Walter still said nothing. He simply crouched near the mud beside the truck's rear axle and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. That was the first moment a few older farmers stopped laughing, because Walter Boone was not looking at the truck. He was studying the ground beneath it, but almost nobody noticed that detail yet. "What's your plan?" Darren asked mockingly. "Pray the truck out." One of the workers shouted. "Careful, Darren. That relic might pull the moon down next." The crowd laughed harder. Walter slowly stood back up. Then he finally spoke. "You've been pulling against the mud," he said quietly. "Not the truck." The sentence barely carried through the wind, but something about the way he said it caused a strange pause across the field. Darren smirked. "Well, enlighten us." Walter ignored him completely. Instead, he walked slowly around the buried trailer while rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap. Every few feet he stopped and pressed his boot into the ground. What happened next would become the part people remembered for years, because Walter suddenly pointed toward the eastern side of the field and said something no engineer there expected to hear. "Don't bring another machine through there," he warned. "There's spring water under that side." Darren rolled his eyes immediately. "You got X-ray vision now, too." The crowd laughed again, but one older farmer near the fence stopped smiling. because he remembered something. That field had once belonged to Walter's father, and suddenly the old man with the rusted tractor did not seem quite as foolish anymore. Still, nobody truly believed what was coming. Not yet, because this story was never really about the truck, and it certainly was not about the mud. The real story had started more than 50 years earlier, during a time when Walter Boone was just a hungry farm boy, standing beside his father in a frozen machine, shed lit by kerosene lamps. Back then, Iowa winters felt longer than they do now. Snow piled against the barn door so heavily that some mornings, Walter and his father had to dig their way outside before feeding the cattle. Their farm sat on 80 struggling acres near the Shell Rock River, and during the worst years of the Dust Bowl, the Boone family nearly lost everything they owned. Banks were swallowing farms all across Iowa during the 1930s. Men who had worked the same land their entire lives suddenly watched strangers nail foreclosure notices onto their doors. Walter remembered hearing his mother cry quietly at night, while his father sat alone in the barn, staring at unpaid bills spread across an old wooden crate. But through all those hard years, one machine never left the farm: the Fordson. Walter's father had bought it used in 1931 after trading nearly half their livestock for it. Even then, the tractor already looked old, but his father trusted simple machines more than fancy promises. And over the years, he taught Walter something most people no longer cared to learn. Machines spoke, not with words, with vibration, weight, heat, sound. You listen long enough, his father once told him, and a machine'll tell you exactly what it needs. Walter learned to rebuild carburetors before he was 12, learned how different soils grabbed steel wheels differently after rain, learned how torque mattered more than horsepower when mud became deep enough to swallow a man to his knees. But there was one thing his father taught him that mattered more than all the rest. Modern men think power fixes everything, he used to say while tightening bolts beneath the Fordson hood. But real pulling ain't about force. It's about understanding what's holding you back. Walter never forgot those words, not even decades later, and standing there in that muddy Iowa field in 1987, surrounded by television cameras and wealthy engineers laughing at him, he realized something none of them yet understood. The truck was not trapped because it was too heavy. It was trapped because every machine before him had pulled the wrong way. By noon, the rain finally stopped, but the field only grew worse. Every passing hour caused the truck to sink another inch into the soaked Iowa ground. Thick black mud pressed tighter around the trailer wheels, while cold wind swept across the empty fields, carrying the smell of diesel, wet dirt, and overheated engines. What had started as a recovery operation was slowly turning into a public spectacle. Cars lined both sides of County Road 14 now. Farmers arrived from neighboring towns after hearing rumors about the old man with the ancient Fordson. Some came because they wanted to laugh. Others came because they remembered Walter Boone from years earlier, back when broken machines still ended up in his barn instead of dealerships. And at the center of all that growing attention stood Darren Cole, whose patience was beginning to crack. At first, Darren had treated Walter like entertainment, a harmless old farmer embarrassing himself in front of a crowd. But now reporters had started pointing cameras away from the expensive recovery rigs and toward the rusty tractor sitting quietly near the ditch. Darren hated that. "You know what this really is," he shouted toward the reporters while mud clung to his boots. "This is nostalgia. People love old junk because it reminds them of simpler times. But simple times don't move 42 tons. Several people laughed nervously, but not as loudly as before, because Walter still had not left. The old man spent nearly an hour walking around the truck in silence, while everyone watched him from a distance. Sometimes he carried a short iron rod, pushing it deep into the mud. Other times he simply stood still, staring across the flooded field, as if reading something invisible beneath the ground. And the strange part was this: the longer Walter studied the field, the calmer he became. That unsettled Darren more than he wanted to admit. A younger salvage operator named Rick finally walked over beside Walter and asked quietly, "You really think there's a way to pull it?" Walter wiped mud from his gloves before answering. "Ain't the truck I'm worried about," he said. Rick frowned. "Then what?" Walter looked toward the eastern side of the field again. "The ground's moving." Rick laughed awkwardly, unsure whether the old man was serious. But Walter was serious, because buried beneath that field was something nobody else there knew existed. Long before the land became commercial farmland, the eastern half of the property had been marshland, fed by underground spring water. Walter's father discovered it back in the 1940s after losing 2 cattle in the mud during an unusually wet spring. Most people forgot about it after drainage crews reshaped the area decades earlier. Walter did not forget. He remembered every inch of that land. He remembered where frost formed first in winter, where rainwater settled longest in autumn, where tractors slipped during planting season. His father had taught him that land carried memory just like people did. And that was exactly why every modern recovery truck had failed. They kept pulling from the wrong direction. Each attempt dragged the trailer deeper into the underground water pocket hidden beneath the field. More force only created more suction. The engineers thought horsepower would solve everything, but Walter knew something they did not. Sometimes power becomes your enemy. That should have been enough to change the story. But there was another secret buried much deeper than the marshland. A secret inside the Fordson itself. Very few people knew Walter's father had worked briefly in a military machine plant during World War II, repairing agricultural equipment converted for supply hauling. During those years, he learned how to modify transmission gearing for extreme low-speed torque. Most men use those techniques for wartime pulling tractors. Walter's father used them on the Fordson, quietly, without telling anyone outside the family. The tractor still looked ordinary from the outside. Rusted hood, old steel wheels, weak engine by modern standards. But hidden beneath the casing sat a custom reduction gear assembly, unlike anything Ford originally installed in 1929. The machine sacrificed speed almost completely in exchange for raw rotational pulling force at extremely low RPMs. Walter had spent nearly 50 years maintaining it by hand. Every bolt, every bearing, every tooth inside the gearbox. And what mattered most was this. The tractor could pull slowly enough to avoid breaking the mud suction grip. Nobody there understood that yet. Not Darren, not the reporters, not even the older farmers watching from the fence lines. But what happened next started changing the mood across the field. At around 2 o'clock, Darren decided to make one final public attempt to recover the truck before sending everyone home. Pride had already pushed him too far to quit quietly. 2 massive recovery rigs rolled into position, while workers attached fresh steel cables thick as a man's wrist. Diesel engines thundered through the cold afternoon air as the crowd backed away from the tensioned lines. Darren glanced toward Walter before climbing onto one of the rigs. "You might want to watch closely, old man," he shouted. "This is what real equipment looks like." Then he gave the signal. Both recovery trucks roared at once. Mud exploded beneath their tires. The cables tightened so violently they began whining like screaming metal. For 1 second, the buried trailer shifted. The crowd gasped. Then came the sound nobody forgot. Crack! One cable snapped through the air like cannon fire. Steel whipped across the mud, smashing into the side of a bulldozer hard enough to dent the frame. Men dove to the ground, while one reporter dropped his camera directly into the mud trying to run. Silence followed. Heavy, cold, uncomfortable silence. The truck had sunk even deeper. One wheel had disappeared almost completely now. Darren climbed down from the recovery rig, pale with anger and humiliation. His expensive jacket was soaked black with mud around the sleeves. The crowd no longer looked impressed by him. They looked uncertain, and slowly, almost unwillingly, many of them started looking toward Walter Boone instead. The old farmer had not moved during the entire failed pull. He simply stood beside the Fordson, with one hand resting on the hood, watching, thinking, waiting. And then he said something so quiet that only the men nearest him heard it clearly. "You can't rip a thing free from ground that's still swallowing it." Rick stared at him. "What does that mean?" Walter looked toward the buried trailer. "It needs to breathe first." That sentence spread across the crowd within minutes. Nobody fully understood it, but somehow it made people stop laughing entirely. Even Darren no longer mocked him openly now. Anger had replaced amusement. "You really think you can do better?" Darren asked coldly. Walter nodded once, not proudly, not dramatically, just once. The crowd immediately pressed closer through the mud. Some climbed onto pickup beds for a better view. Others moved near the roadside fences. Reporters raised cameras again. The entire field suddenly felt charged with the kind of tension that appears just before something impossible either succeeds or fails in front of everyone. But before Walter touched the tractor, he did something unexpected. He asked for a longer chain, not a stronger one, a longer one. The salvage workers looked confused. "You need more pulling force," one engineer argued. Walter slowly shook his head. "No," he replied. "You need less shock." The engineer frowned. "That makes no sense." Walter looked directly at him for the first time. "Because you boys are trying to fight the mud," he said. "I'm trying to teach it to let go." The field went quiet again, and somewhere deep beneath the buried truck, hidden under tons of soaked Iowa earth, something had already begun to move. Walter climbed onto the Fordson as the cold Iowa wind swept across the field. The crowd stood silently now, no longer laughing. Even Darren Cole watched without speaking. The old tractor came alive with a deep metallic growl, black smoke rolling into the dark afternoon sky. Walter kept the throttle low, moving forward inch by inch while the long chain slowly tightened behind him. At first, nothing happened. Some people in the crowd began smirking again. Then the mud beneath the buried truck started shifting strangely. Water bubbled around the wheels. The ground almost seemed to loosen its grip. Walter never rushed. He understood something the engineers did not. The truck did not need brute force. It needed the suction beneath it broken slowly. The Fordson crawled forward again. A loud crack echoed beneath the earth. One side of the trailer lifted. The crowd gasped. Walter increased the throttle slightly, and suddenly the massive truck lurched free from the mud for the first time in 3 days. 42 tons of steel began moving behind a rusted 1929 tractor, while the entire field erupted into chaos. Men shouted. Reporters ran closer. Even the salvage workers stood frozen in disbelief. But Walter simply kept driving slowly until the truck reached solid gravel near the road. Then he stopped the Fordson, climbed down quietly, and wiped mud from the steel wheel with his glove, as if he had merely finished another ordinary day on the farm. That moment humiliated Darren Cole more than any insult ever could. Within weeks, footage of the recovery spread across Iowa. Farmers everywhere talked about the old Fordson that succeeded where modern machines failed. People began bringing old tractors out of forgotten barns again, and young mechanics started visiting Walter to learn how the machine worked. Meanwhile, Darren's company lost several contracts after the public disaster, but Walter never mocked him. In fact, months later, when one of Darren's younger workers came asking to learn from him, Walter welcomed him into his workshop without hesitation, because Walter Boone never cared about proving himself superior. He only cared about understanding the land, the machine, and the work itself. Years later, people still remember the day the old Fordson pulled the buried truck free from the Iowa mud. But the story was never really about the tractor. It was about pride, about how quickly people laugh at things they no longer understand, and about the quiet kind of wisdom that survives long after expensive machines, loud men, and public arrogance disappear. Because sometimes the strongest thing in the world is not the newest machine in the field. Sometimes it is the old man who has spent his whole life learning how the ground beneath it truly works.